My name is Shirley Mae Donovan, and I am 78 years old. My heart, still shattered by loss, became a fragile target for the most insidious betrayal. I dedicated my life to my family, supporting my late husband's business and cherishing our daughter Emily. After Emily's tragic death in a car accident 3 years ago, my grief consumed me like a relentless tide. I poured my love into preserving her memory, creating a scholarship in her name, constantly longing for the family we could have had. This made me profoundly susceptible to anything connected to her precious memory. In my deepest grief, David, my estranged former son-in-law, orchestrated a monstrous scheme. An imposter named Ethan appeared armed with forged documents, mimicking Emily's quirks, claiming to be her secret son. Overwhelmed by joy at this miracle, I transferred my entire fortune to him for his future. Then the mask dropped. Ethan revealed with cruel satisfaction, "You really believed all that, old woman. Your grief was a goldmine." Yet amidst the shattering devastation, a flicker of defiance ignited within me. Unbeknownst to David, an antique family locket held tiny, distinct hair samples from Emily. And Emily, always private, kept a small, password-protected online journal detailing her life, directly contradicting David's fabricated narrative. These hidden keys were my only hope for justice. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday morning in September, cutting through the silence that had become my constant companion. There he stood, a young man with Emily's exact shade of brown hair and her delicate chin. My knees nearly buckled. "Grandmother Shirley." His voice carried a tremor of uncertainty that made my heart leap with recognition. "I'm Ethan. I think I'm your grandson." My home, once filled with the warmth of my late husband Harold's presence, now echoed with this young man's carefully constructed energy. Every gesture seemed designed to remind me of Emily. The way he tilted his head when listening, how he unconsciously touched his left temple when thinking. These were Emily's mannerisms, and seeing them again after 3 years of mourning felt like a resurrection. David remained unseen during those early weeks, orchestrating every detail from the shadows. Ethan's visits were perfectly timed, ensuring I remained isolated in my grief-fueled joy. He would arrive just as I was settling into my afternoon routine, bringing flowers that matched Emily's favorites, speaking of dreams that echoed her childhood aspirations. "Emily never told me about you," I whispered during his third visit, my voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady tick. His eyes filled with practiced tears. "She was protecting me, grandmother. She said the family was complicated, that there were people who might hurt me if they knew I existed." He reached across the coffee table, his young hand covering my weathered one. "She said, you were the only one who would understand real love." The words pierced straight through my defenses. This was exactly what Emily would have said, exactly how she would have protected someone precious to her. Within days, Ethan began subtly inquiring about my financial situation. It started innocently enough. He expressed concern about my living alone in such a large house, worried about my ability to maintain it. Then came the gentle suggestions about securing his future. "Emily told me about the scholarship fund you created," he said one afternoon as we sat in her old bedroom surrounded by her childhood memories. "She said you were the most generous person she knew. But grandmother, what about protecting what's left for family?" His voice carried that innocent, vulnerable tone that exploited my deepest maternal instincts. When he spoke of needing security, of being afraid he might lose the only family he had left, my resistance crumbled like sand. "I've been thinking." He continued, his eyes downcast with apparent shame. maybe it would be wise to transfer some assets into my name. For tax purposes, to protect our family's future together. I should have questioned this. Harold would have demanded documentation verification proof. But Harold was gone, and I was drowning in loneliness, clinging to this miraculous connection to my beloved Emily. Of course, sweetheart, I heard myself saying. Anything for Emily's son. The isolation began so gradually, I barely noticed. Ethan would arrive just as my neighbor Mrs. Patterson was leaving, offering to help with whatever she had planned to assist me with. He discouraged visits from my few remaining friends, claiming they tired me, that I seemed stressed after their departures. "You look so peaceful when it's just us, grandmother," he would say, those Emily-like eyes filled with apparent concern. "Maybe you should focus on family for now. These people, they don't really understand what you're going through." He created emergencies that prevented me from attending my weekly bridge club, my monthly book group, even Emily's scholarship committee meetings. A sudden illness, an important appointment, a family matter that required my immediate attention. To outsiders, I began to appear reclusive, perhaps even unwell. One evening, I noticed Emily's high school graduation photo was missing from the mantelpiece. When I asked about it, Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Grandmother, are you feeling all right? There's never been a photo there. Maybe you're thinking of the one in the hallway." But there was no photo in the hallway. There never had been. Yet his certainty made me question my own memory, my own connection to my daughter's life. The financial requests escalated with practiced precision. First, it was a college fund, $20,000 to secure his education. Then came the medical emergency. His appendix, he claimed, required immediate surgery, and he had no insurance. $50,000 disappeared in a day. "Grandmother," he said during what I now realize was a carefully orchestrated conversation, "I've been thinking about our future together. This house, it's so big for just one person. What if we transferred it into my name? For tax purposes, of course. I promise I'll live here and take care of you forever. It would be like having Emily back, taking care of her family." The promise of never being alone again, of having family under this roof, where Emily had grown up, where Harold and I had shared 43 years of marriage. It was everything I had been desperately praying for. I signed the papers with trembling hands, believing I was securing not just his future, but mine. Believing I was honoring Emily's secret legacy, ensuring her son would always have a home, always have the love she had wanted him to have. "You're so good to me, grandmother," Ethan whispered as I handed over the deed. "Emily would be so proud of how you're loving her son." But even as I smiled through my tears of joy, something deep inside me began to whisper warnings I wasn't yet ready to hear. The change began the moment the final papers were signed. It was subtle at first, like watching clouds gather before a storm you don't yet realize is coming. Ethan's visits became shorter, his attention more distracted. The flowers stopped coming. The gentle questions about my day transformed into impatient nods while he scrolled through his phone. But most unsettling was how he began looking at my home, not with the reverence of someone cherishing family history, but with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. "Grandmother," he said one afternoon, his voice carrying a new edge of authority, "I've been thinking about your living situation. This house is really too much for someone your age to manage. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, simpler." The word comfortable felt like ice in my veins. This was my home, the place where Harold and I had built our life, where Emily had taken her first steps, celebrated her birthdays, graduated from high school. Every room held memories more precious than gold. "But Ethan, this is where Emily grew up. Surely you want to preserve her childhood home." His laugh was different, now lacking the warmth that had once made my heart soar. Grandmother, I think you're getting a bit sentimental about old things. What matters is being practical about the future. The demands began escalating with frightening speed. My credit cards, which he now had access to as my caregiver, were being used for purchases I didn't recognize. Designer clothes, expensive electronics dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. When I questioned these charges, his explanations became increasingly dismissive. I'm a young man, Grandmother. I have needs, friends, a life to build. Isn't that what you wanted for Emily's son to have everything he deserves? Then came the moment that shattered everything I had believed. We were sitting in Emily's old bedroom, a space I had kept exactly as she left it, when Ethan picked up her favorite book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, with her handwritten notes in the margins. God, who reads this boring stuff anyway, he muttered, tossing it carelessly onto the floor. The sound of that book hitting the hardwood was like a gunshot in my chest. Emily had read that book 17 times. She had quoted passages from it in her graduation speech. She had named her beloved cat Scout after the main character, Ethan. I whispered, my voice trembling. That was Emily's favorite book. She read it every summer. He shrugged with infuriating indifference. Yeah, well, people outgrow things, don't they? Maybe she would have moved on to better books if she'd lived longer. If she'd lived longer. The casual cruelty of those words, the complete lack of reverence for Emily's memory, hit me like a physical blow. This was not how Emily's son would speak about his mother. This was not how someone who loved her would treat her treasured possessions. In that horrifying moment, the truth crashed over me like a devastating tide. This young man knew nothing about Emily beyond what could be researched online or gleaned from public records. He had never heard her laugh at old movies, never seen her cry over injured animals, never witnessed the way she unconsciously hummed while cooking, the little intimate details that only someone who truly loved her would know. But the revelation that broke me completely came flooding back in vivid, agonizing detail. Years ago, when Emily was 22, she had fallen deeply in love with a young man who betrayed her trust, broke her heart, and left her devastated. I had watched my vibrant daughter become a shell of herself, barely eating, barely sleeping, her spirit crushed by his cruelty. Without telling Harold, without telling anyone, I had used $30,000 from our retirement savings to send Emily to Europe for an entire year. I told Harold it was a work opportunity, but the truth was far more personal. I had sacrificed our financial security to give my daughter space to heal, to rediscover herself, to remember that she was worthy of real love. During that year abroad, Emily had found herself again. She had written to me about the small villages in France where she taught English, about the kindness of strangers who became friends, about slowly learning to trust her own heart again. When she returned, she was stronger, wiser, and more cautious about love. She never again spoke of wanting children from casual relationships. She had become someone who guarded her heart carefully, who valued privacy above all else. The Emily I knew would never have had a secret child. The Emily I raised would never have kept such a profound secret from the mother who had sacrificed everything for her healing. This realization hit me with the force of complete betrayal. My deepest act of maternal love, my most profound sacrifice for Emily's well-being, now highlighted the cruel impossibility of David's fabricated story. When I tried to confront Ethan with my growing suspicions, when I attempted to appeal to whatever conscience might exist beneath his facade, the mask dropped with terrifying swiftness. You really believed all that old woman? His face contorted into something ugly and predatory. Your daughter, Emily. She was pathetic, just like you. Weak, sentimental, easy to manipulate, and so was your money. Honestly, it was like taking candy from a baby. The words hit me like physical blows, each one calculated to cause maximum pain. But then David appeared as if he had been waiting in the wings for this moment of revelation. "Honestly, Shirley," David said, with a cold, triumphant smirk that made my blood freeze, "your grief was a gold mine. We knew you'd fall for it. You were so desperate for a piece of Emily, so pathetically lonely, you forgot to use your brain." The room spun around me as the full scope of their cruelty became clear. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had weaponized my love for my daughter, turned my deepest grief into their personal profit, transformed the most sacred relationship of my life into a tool for their greed. "The nursing home paperwork is already filled out," David continued with clinical detachment. "You're going to be declared mentally incompetent. Don't worry, though. We'll take good care of Emily's scholarship fund. I'm sure we can find better uses for that money, too." As I sat there surrounded by Emily's belongings in the room where she had dreamed of her future, I realized I was facing not just financial ruin, but the complete destruction of everything I had lived for. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small flame of defiance began to flicker. They had underestimated one crucial thing. A mother's love never truly dies, and neither does her fierce determination to protect what matters most. The transport van arrived at 7 a.m, its institutional white paint gleaming ominously in the early autumn light. I had been awake all night, sitting in Harold's old recliner, clutching Emily's photograph, knowing this day would come, but still unprepared for its brutal reality. David strode through my front door, my former front door, without knocking, followed by Ethan and 2 uniformed men who looked like they had experience handling difficult elderly patients. The casual way they invaded the space where I had lived for 46 years felt like a violation of everything sacred. "Time to go, Shirley," David announced with the cold efficiency of someone discussing garbage collection. He carried a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "The Sunset Manor Care Facility is expecting you by noon. They specialize in patients with your particular challenges." "My challenges." The words came out as barely a whisper. Ethan, no longer bothering with his Emily-like mannerisms, rolled his eyes with theatrical exasperation. "The dementia, grandmother, the paranoid delusions, the way you keep insisting I'm not really Emily's son, remember? The cruelty of using my own love against me, of twisting my desperate search for truth into evidence of mental illness, took my breath away. These falsified documents would paint me as a confused, possibly dangerous old woman who needed to be removed from society for everyone's protection. You can't do this." I tried to stand, my legs shaking with a combination of rage and terror. "This is my home. I've lived here longer than you've been alive, David." One of the uniformed men stepped forward with practiced gentleness that somehow made everything worse. "Now, Mrs. Donovan, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We're here to help you transition to a place where you'll get the care you need." Care. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. The Sunset Manor Care Facility. I had looked it up during my sleepless night. It was a state-run institution 40 miles outside the city with a reputation for warehousing patients rather than caring for them. Understaffed, underfunded, and perfectly designed to make inconvenient people disappear from the world. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking, as I looked around the living room where Harold and I had celebrated 43 Christmas mornings, where Emily had played with her dolls, where 3 generations of my family had built a lifetime of memories. "Don't make me leave Emily's home. This is all I have left of her." David's response was to walk deliberately to the mantelpiece where I kept Emily's most precious belongings. With calculated cruelty, he picked up the antique locket that had belonged to my grandmother, the one containing the tiny samples of Emily's hair I had saved from her first haircut, her first day of school, her prom night. "You won't be needing sentimental garbage where you're going," he said, and with a motion that seemed designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, he tossed the locket into the nearby trash bin. The sound of that precious heirloom hitting the bottom of the garbage can was like hearing Emily die all over again. That locket contained the only physical traces of my daughter I had left, the DNA evidence that could prove Ethan's lies, the tangible connection to 4 generations of women in my family. No, I lunged toward the trash, but the uniformed men, gently but firmly, restrained me. "See what I mean?" David said to the men with false concern. "These episodes are getting worse. She's become obsessed with objects, convinced they have some kind of magical significance." But as they began to force me toward the door, as I felt the life I had built slipping away forever, something inside me erupted with fierce, desperate clarity. The fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my judgment for months suddenly lifted, replaced by a searing understanding of exactly what I was facing and exactly what weapons I had left to fight with. "David," I called out, my voice ringing with unexpected power that made everyone in the room freeze. "Emily kept a secret online journal." The effect was immediate and dramatic. David's face went white, his confident smirk disappearing as if I had struck him. Ethan looked confused, but David clearly understood the implications of what I was saying. "She wrote everything in it." I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "About your true criminal past, your years of embezzlement from Harold's business, and how you tried to force her into illegal schemes when you were married. That's why she divorced you, David. That's why she cut you completely out of her life. That's why there was never any secret child. Because Emily documented every cruel, criminal thing you ever did." The silence in the room was deafening. David's face had gone from white to red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Ethan was staring at him with dawning comprehension, clearly realizing he had been involved in something far more complex and dangerous than simple elder fraud. "She wrote about the money you stole from elderly clients at the investment firm." I pressed on, remembering fragments of conversations Emily had shared during those dark months before her divorce. "About the fake accounts, the forged signatures, the way you preyed on people who trusted you with their life savings. She kept records, David. She kept everything." "You're lying," David snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Emily never kept journals. She hated writing." "She kept an online journal for 7 years," I said with absolute certainty. "Password protected, encrypted, detailed. And I know the password, David. I know it because she told me about it the week before she died. She was planning to turn those records over to the authorities. She said she couldn't live with the guilt of staying silent about what you had done to innocent people." This was not entirely true. Emily had never explicitly told me about planning to expose David's crimes, but she had mentioned the journal had shared the password during a moment of vulnerability and had expressed deep regret about not speaking up sooner about David's behavior. In this moment of desperate truth-telling, I was gambling everything on the possibility that Emily's natural sense of justice had led her to document David's crimes. The transformation in David was terrifying to witness. The cold, calculating predator was replaced by something wild and dangerous, a cornered animal, realizing that his carefully constructed scheme was built on quicksand. Even if such a journal existed, he said through gritted teeth, no one would believe the ravings of a diagnosed dementia patient. "Maybe not," I replied, feeling a strange calm settle over me. But they'd certainly investigate the claims. They'd look into your financial records, David. They'd contact your former clients, review those old cases Emily mentioned. They'd discover that this whole elaborate scheme with Ethan here was just your latest attempt to steal money from vulnerable people. The two uniformed men were looking increasingly uncomfortable, clearly realizing they had walked into something far more complicated than a simple involuntary commitment. Even with falsified documents, David's scheme would crumble under real scrutiny, especially if there was evidence of a broader pattern of financial crimes. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of real hope. They had underestimated me, assumed that grief had made me weak and foolish. But grief had also made me desperate, and desperate people fight hardest when they have nothing left to lose. The battle for my freedom, my dignity, and Emily's true legacy was just beginning. The silence that followed my revelation about Emily's journal seemed to stretch for an eternity. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the surge of internal power that comes from holding the truth. My hands were still trembling, my heart still racing from the confrontation, but deep inside, a core of steel had crystallized. You built your scheme on a grave, David. I said, my voice quiet, but ringing with conviction that surprised even me. But Emily's truth will bury you. From this moment, the illusion is shattered. You are nothing to me. I turned to look directly at Ethan, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as Emily's miraculous son, but as the hollow imposter he had always been. And as for you, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. Your role is over. You are not my grandson. You never were. You're simply a young man who sold his soul for money that was never his to take. This was more than just words. It was a profound severance of all ties to the deceit that had consumed my life. I was cutting away the cancer of their lies, even though it meant accepting the devastating truth that I was truly alone. David stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and something that looked almost like fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, he appeared genuinely rattled. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and we both knew it. You're insane, he stammered, his voice lacking its usual smooth confidence. There is no journal. Emily never kept journals. She hated writing. You're having dementia episodes, Shirley. These are delusions brought on by grief and old age. But even as he spoke, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate mental scrambling of someone trying to determine how much damage had been done. Ethan looked genuinely confused, glancing nervously between David and me, his practiced facade cracking like a mask that no longer fit properly. The transport is waiting, David said, his voice regaining some authority as he gestured toward the uniformed men. But there was something different now, a urgency that hadn't been there before, as if he suddenly needed me out of the way more desperately than ever. As the men gently but firmly guided me toward the door, I walked with a dignity I hadn't felt in months. Yes, I was being forced from my home, stripped of my possessions, separated from everything I held dear. But my spirit was no longer broken. The truth was a flame they couldn't extinguish, and I carried it with me like a sacred torch. At the threshold of my home, the doorway where Harold had carried me as a bride, where Emily had taken her first steps, where 3 generations of love had been built, I turned back to face David one final time. Emily's words will be your judge, David, I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, and they will speak volumes about the kind of man you really are. As the transport door closed behind me, I immediately began focusing on my next move. I wasn't helpless, despite their efforts to make me appear so. I had one crucial advantage they didn't know about. My cousin George, a retired attorney who had helped Harold and me with our wills and estate planning. George was sharp ethical, and most importantly, he knew me well enough to recognize that I was far from the confused, delusional woman David was trying to portray. Behind me, through the van's small window, I could see David exploding in a fit of barely controlled rage. He was pacing the driveway, his hands clenched into fists, his face red with fury. I could see him gesticulating wildly at Ethan, who was backing away with increasing unease. The truth was a powerful thing, and David was discovering that some lies were too big to sustain once the light began shining on them. He could threaten me, discredit me, even have me locked away. But he couldn't change the fact that Emily's journal existed, that her words would contradict every lie he had built his scheme upon. As we drove away from the only home I had known for nearly half a century, I felt something unexpected, a strange sense of liberation. Yes, I was grieving. Yes, I was terrified of what lay ahead. But for the first time in months, my mind was clear, my purpose focused, and my determination unshakable. The battle was far from over, but I had drawn first blood. And David Miller was about to discover that he had gravely underestimated the power of a mother's love to seek justice, even from beyond the grave. The Sunset Manor Care Facility was everything I had feared and worse. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the odors of neglect and despair that seemed to permeate every corner. But instead of breaking my spirit, the grim surroundings only sharpened my focus. I had work to do and very little time to do it. Within my first week, I began using the skills that had served me well as Harold's business partner for over 20 years: observation patience and the ability to identify allies. I watched the staff carefully noting who truly cared about the residents and who was simply collecting a paycheck. Nurse Carol Martinez stood out immediately. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes that actually made contact when she spoke to residents. More importantly, she treated us like human beings rather than inconvenient problems to be managed. I watched her take extra time to comfort Mrs. Henderson when she cried for her deceased husband, saw her gently redirect Mr. Peterson when his memory failed him, observed her quiet acts of dignity in a place where dignity was in short supply. My new status, I realized, was that of a strategic survivor. The confused, grief-stricken woman who had been so easily manipulated was gone, replaced by someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I began to use my meticulous nature and powers of observation as weapons in a war David didn't even know was being fought. The major opportunity I needed was twofold: access to Emily's online journal and contact with my cousin George. The facility allowed residents supervised computer time twice a week, but the sessions were brief and heavily monitored. However, I had another plan, one that required careful execution and perfect timing. During one of Carol's evening rounds, I approached her with what appeared to be a simple request. "My dear," I said, my voice carrying just the right note of elderly confusion mixed with urgency. "I'm so worried about my cousin George. He's been handling some legal matters for me, and I haven't heard from him since I arrived here. Could you possibly help an old woman contact her family?" I had crafted this request carefully, making it sound like the reasonable concern of an elderly woman worried about family connections. What I actually handed her was a small, seemingly innocent note that contained coded information: Emily's birthday, the name of her childhood pet, and the phrase "butterfly journal," subtle references that would make sense to George, who had known Emily since she was born. The note also contained George's contact information and a carefully worded message: emergency regarding Emily's private writings. David Miller fraud investigation needed. Shirley detained against will at Sunset Manor. Please verify journal access immediately. Time-sensitive legal matter. Carol, bless her heart, didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and promised to make sure the message reached George. I could see in her eyes that she sensed something deeper was happening, that this wasn't just an elderly woman missing her family. 3 days later, my patience was rewarded in the most unexpected way. During the facility's routine visiting hours, I was sitting in the common room when I heard familiar voices approaching. My blood chilled as I recognized David's smooth, confident tone and Ethan's younger voice responding to questions. They had come to flaunt their victory. David entered the common room like a conquering hero, dressed in an expensive suit I recognized. It had belonged to Harold. The sight of him wearing my deceased husband's clothing was like a knife to the heart, but I maintained my composure. Ethan followed behind, also well-dressed, carrying what appeared to be a tablet displaying photos. They were accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, a social worker I gathered from their conversation who had been arranged by David to monitor my progress and presumably report back on my mental state. This was all part of his plan to ensure I remained discredited and contained. There she is, David announced loudly, his voice carrying across the room to ensure maximum humiliation. Poor Shirley. It's so sad to see how quickly the mind can deteriorate, isn't it? He approached my chair with a condescending smile that made my skin crawl. How are you feeling today, Shirley? Are you remembering things more clearly now? The social worker was taking notes, observing our interaction with professional detachment. Several other residents and their visitors had turned to watch, creating exactly the kind of public audience David wanted for this performance. We've been taking such good care of your beautiful home, Ethan added, holding up the tablet to show photos of my house. My house, renovated with my money. New furniture, fresh paint, a modernized kitchen. They had erased every trace of Harold's and Emily's presence, turning our family home into a showcase for their stolen wealth. The scholarship fund Emily established is being managed so well, David continued with false concern. We're making sure the money goes to truly deserving students, not just anyone who applies. The implication was clear. They were stealing from Emily's scholarship as well, using my daughter's charitable legacy as their personal piggy bank. The violation felt deeper than anything they had done to me personally. You look tired, Shirley. David said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I hope you're not having any more of those episodes. You know, the delusions about imaginary journals and made-up stories about poor Emily. This was his masterstroke, publicly painting me as a confused, possibly dangerous woman whose claims couldn't be trusted. He was building a narrative that would discredit anything I might say or do in the future. But as he spoke, I noticed movement near the reception desk. Carol was approaching, carrying a sealed envelope, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with what looked like anticipation. Mrs. Donovan, Carol said quietly, you have some correspondence from your family. The envelope she handed me was thick, official-looking, and bore George's law firm letterhead. Inside, visible through the opening, I could see printed pages, and I recognized Emily's distinctive writing style from the headers. The effect on David was immediate and dramatic. His confident smirk froze, then slowly melted into an expression of shock and growing horror. Ethan looked confused, but David clearly understood the implications of what he was seeing. Some inheritances are built on lies, David, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. But Emily's true legacy, like all truth, cannot be hidden forever. and her voice, unlike yours, will be heard. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was the one holding the power, and David Miller was the one who looked afraid. The pages in my hands represented more than just evidence. They were Emily's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, and that voice was about to shatter David's world completely. George had moved quickly, more quickly than I had dared hope. Along with the journal excerpts, his letter informed me that he had already contacted Detective Sarah Chen of the Financial Crimes Unit, and that formal proceedings were being initiated immediately. Within 48 hours of receiving Emily's journal pages, I was sitting in a conference room at the police station with George at my side, Detective Chen across from us, and a stenographer recording every word. This was my moment to strike back with the full force of the law behind me. I want to file formal charges against David Miller and the young man known as Ethan Walsh for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and grand larceny. I stated clearly, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was doing. Detective Chen was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. She had seen cases like mine before, but she told me later that the sophistication of David's scheme and the coldness of his execution had shocked even her. "Mrs. Donovan," she said, "these are serious charges. We'll need substantial evidence to proceed." That's when I presented Emily's journal entries, page after page of her private thoughts, documenting her marriage to David, his increasingly erratic behavior, his attempts to involve her in questionable financial schemes, and ultimately her decision to divorce him and cut all contact. Most importantly, Emily had written extensively about her decision never to have children, her fear of bringing a child into a world where people like David existed. The entries were dated detailed and absolutely devastating to David's narrative. Emily had written about David's history of financial manipulation, his pattern of targeting vulnerable people, and her growing realization that she had married a sociopath. She was planning to turn him in, I explained to Detective Chen. Emily wrote that she had been gathering evidence of David's crimes against his elderly clients, documenting everything she could remember. She felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. George had also brought something else, the antique locket David had thrown in the trash. Carol had retrieved it after witnessing the cruel gesture, sensing its importance. The tiny hair samples inside would prove through DNA testing that Ethan was no relation to Emily whatsoever, but David wasn't going down without a fight. When word of the investigation reached him, he launched a desperate campaign of public slander that was as vicious as it was transparent. He contacted everyone we had known, spreading lies about my mental state, claiming I was suffering from severe dementia, and that George was a greedy lawyer manipulating a confused old woman. He created social media accounts dedicated to painting himself as the victim of a senile woman's vindictive fantasies. He claimed I had always been jealous of his relationship with Emily, that I had never accepted him as a son-in-law, and that I was using my remaining money to destroy him out of spite. Ethan backed him up with his own performance appearing on local news to express his heartbreak over being rejected by his mentally ill grandmother. They painted a picture of two innocent people being persecuted by a delusional elderly woman and her corrupt attorney. But I had learned something about the power of truth during those dark months of deception. Truth has weight, substance, staying power that lies simply cannot match, and I was about to demonstrate that power in the most public way possible. George arranged for a press conference outside the police station. Detective Chen stood with us, lending the authority of law enforcement to our cause. But the real power came from Emily herself, her own words spoken from beyond the grave. I had brought Harold's old cassette recorder, a device Emily had used to record her thoughts when writing became too difficult during her depression after her first heartbreak. George had converted several of Emily's most damning journal entries to audio, having them read by a neutral voice to avoid any claims of family bias. My daughter Emily was a private person. I began my voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. She trusted few people with her deepest thoughts, but she documented her life carefully, including her relationship with David Miller and the reasons she chose to divorce him. As Emily's words filled the air, her descriptions of David's manipulative behavior, his financial crimes, his attempts to involve her in illegal schemes. I watched David's public image crumble in real time. Local news crews were present recording everything. Social media posts began appearing immediately sharing Emily's devastating testimony. The DNA results from the locket came back within days, confirming what we all knew. Ethan shared no genetic material with Emily whatsoever. He wasn't her son, her cousin, or any relation at all. He was simply a young man David had hired to play a role, promising him a percentage of whatever they could steal from me. The consequences for David were swift and severe. The local newspaper picked up the story, running headlines about the grandson scam and how grief became a weapon. His few remaining friends and acquaintances distanced themselves immediately. His apartment building manager asked him to leave. Even his attorney began distancing himself from the case. Within a week, George had secured warrants for both David's and Ethan's arrests. Ethan, realizing the full scope of what he had become involved in, turned himself in and agreed to testify against David in exchange for a reduced sentence. David was arrested at his apartment, his face showing the hollow desperation of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed overnight. The investigation into recovering my stolen assets began immediately. George had frozen David's accounts and begun the process of reclaiming my home, my investments, and every penny they had stolen. The legal machinery that David had used against me was now working in my favor, and it was relentless. But beyond the legal victories, something more profound had occurred. Emily's voice had been heard. Her truth had prevailed. Her memory had been vindicated. And I had learned that even in the depths of grief and betrayal, the human spirit possesses a strength that no amount of cruelty can completely destroy. 3 weeks after David's arrest, as I was settling into the comfortable guest room in George's home, while my own house was being restored to its proper state, the phone rang. George had installed caller ID at my request, so I could see David's name glowing on the small screen. He was out on bail, facing multiple felony charges, and apparently desperate enough to violate the no-contact order that had been issued as part of his release conditions. I could have ignored the call. George had advised me to. Detective Chen had warned me that David might try to contact me, hoping to manipulate me into dropping the charges or somehow salvaging his situation. But I realized I wanted to hear what he had to say. After months of being his victim, I was curious to see how he would approach me now that our positions were completely reversed. "Hello, David," I said calmly as I answered the phone. His voice hit me immediately, no longer smooth or cunning, but raw with fear, desperation, and barely controlled rage. "Shirley, thank God you answered. You have to listen to me. You have to understand what you're doing." There was none of the calculated charm he had used through Ethan, none of the cold confidence he had displayed during my expulsion from my home. This was the voice of a cornered animal, and it was strangely satisfying to hear. "You're destroying my life," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "Do you understand that everything I've worked for, everything I've built, you're tearing it all down with these lies. I said nothing, simply listened to the man who had orchestrated my devastation, now experiencing his own. This is all a misunderstanding, Shirley, a terrible misunderstanding that got out of hand. You always said you were a kind woman, a forgiving woman. Where is that kindness now? Where is that Christian forgiveness you used to talk about? The manipulation was still there, but it was clumsy now, desperate. He was trying to use my own faith and values against me, just as he had used my love for Emily. But those weapons no longer had any power over me. I'm begging you, David continued, his voice breaking into what sounded like genuine sobs. Please, tell the police it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you were confused, that grief made you imagine things that weren't real. I'll disappear, Shirley. I'll leave the state, leave the country if you want. Just please, please don't destroy me. When he finished his plea, I let the silence stretch for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was steady and unwavering, completely devoid of the emotion he was desperately trying to evoke, I spoke. David, I said, your choices led you here. You chose to exploit grief. You chose to steal from a grieving mother. You chose to desecrate Emily's memory for money. These are the consequences of your actions, not mine. The truth has been revealed, and it has set me free. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, processing my words, realizing that his emotional manipulation was falling on deaf ears. Then his approach shifted dramatically, as I had known it would. The pleading tone disappeared, replaced by something more calculating, more familiar. Surely I know you've recovered some of your assets, he said, his voice taking on a wheedling quality. George has been very busy protecting your interests, hasn't he? You must be feeling quite comfortable again. He was probing, trying to determine the extent of my financial recovery, searching for some angle he could exploit even now. Look, he continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. I know we've had our differences, but we're still family in a way, aren't we? Emily connected us, and that connection doesn't just disappear because of some unfortunate misunderstandings. The audacity was breathtaking. Even facing prison, even after being completely exposed, he was still looking for an angle, still searching for a way to benefit from his relationship to my dead daughter. I'm in a very difficult financial situation. He pressed on, abandoning all pretense of dignity. The legal fees alone are going to bankrupt me. And if I lose everything, if I go to prison, it won't bring Emily back, Shirley. It won't undo anything that happened. But maybe if you could see your way clear to help with just the attorney costs. He was actually asking me for money. The man who had stolen everything I owned, who had violated my deepest grief, who had turned my love for my daughter into a weapon against me. He was asking me to fund his defense against the charges I had brought against him. David, I said, my voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of absolute finality. The man I once tolerated as Emily's husband died the moment he chose to become a serpent, preying on my broken heart. What speaks to me now is a stranger, a criminal, who is merely the consequence of your own venom. I paused, letting the words sink in, feeling the strange peace that comes with absolute clarity. My peace was bought with profound sorrow, and it will not be disturbed again. You are no longer part of my life, David. You never really were. You were just a mistake Emily made when she was young, and that mistake has finally been corrected. The silence that followed was long and heavy. When David finally spoke again, his voice carried a cold fury that reminded me exactly why Emily had been so afraid of him. You'll regret this, Shirley. When I get out of prison, and I will get out, you'll regret destroying me. Goodbye, David, I said calmly, and hung up the phone. Immediately, I called George and reported the violation of the no contact order. Within hours, David's bail was revoked and he was back in custody. There would be no more phone calls, no more attempts at manipulation, no more opportunities for him to invade my peace. George helped me change my phone number and block all possible avenues of communication. The chapter of my life that had included David Miller was finally definitively closed. As I sat in George's comfortable living room that evening, watching the sunset through windows that overlooked a garden Emily had loved as a child, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Complete and utter peace. The nightmare was over. Emily's memory had been vindicated. Justice had been served, and I was free. 2 years had passed since David's conviction and imprisonment. In that time, my story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a rallying cry for elder rights advocates across the country. What had begun as my personal nightmare had transformed into a powerful force for protecting other vulnerable seniors from similar predators. The Riverside Community Center was decorated with autumn flowers and filled with warm faces as I prepared to accept the Elder Advocacy Award from the National Association for Senior Protection. George sat in the front row, beaming with pride, surrounded by the new friends I had made through my advocacy work. Detective Chen Nurse Carol, who had helped me at that terrible facility, and dozens of seniors who had found the courage to report their own experiences with fraud after hearing my story. I was wearing Emily's pearl necklace, the one David had overlooked in his greed, and I felt her presence with me as I stood to approach the podium. The warmth in the room was palpable. These people understood what I had endured, and they honored not just my survival, but my transformation of pain into purpose. That's when I saw him. David Miller stood near the back entrance, flanked by 2 people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman and an elderly man who both wore expressions of misguided sympathy. David looked older, thinner, his expensive suits replaced by ill-fitting clothes that spoke of diminished circumstances, but his eyes still held that calculating gleam I remembered so well. He had somehow made bail pending his appeal, and now he was here in this sacred space where survivors gathered to heal and help others. The sight of him felt like a violation, but I steeled myself, remembering all I had learned about predators. They never truly stop hunting. As I reached the podium and began to thank the organization for the honor, David's voice suddenly cut through the respectful silence like a blade. "This is all lies," he shouted, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone with nothing left to lose. "That woman is a fraud. She's a vengeful, bitter old woman who fabricated everything for money and attention." The room fell silent, shocked by the outburst. I could see the confusion on many faces. Who was this man? Why was he disrupting our ceremony? David stepped forward, his 2 companions flanking him like supporters at a rally. "I'm David Miller," he announced, his voice gaining strength as he fed off the attention. "I was married to this woman's daughter, and I'm telling you that Shirley Donovan is a liar. She made up that whole story about Emily's journal. She twisted everything to frame me because she never liked me, never accepted me as family." The woman beside him nodded sympathetically, adding her voice to his. "David has been through so much. This poor man has been persecuted by a woman driven by jealousy and grief. Family disputes can be so ugly when money is involved." I felt the familiar chill of manipulation, the way David could twist truth into something unrecognizable. Some people in the audience began to murmur their certainty, shaken. After all, family conflicts were complicated, and here was a man claiming to be the victim of the very person they were honoring. She destroyed my life with her lies, David continued, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. I loved Emily. I would never have hurt her memory, but Shirley couldn't stand that Emily had chosen me, couldn't accept that I was part of the family. The elderly man with him stepped forward, his voice trembling with apparent concern. I've known David for years. He's a good man who made some mistakes, but nothing like what this woman claims. Sometimes grief can make people do terrible things even to innocent people. For a moment, the room wavered. I could see doubt creeping into some faces, the terrible uncertainty that comes when someone presents an alternative version of truth with enough conviction to sow confusion. This was David's greatest skill, his ability to make people question their own judgment, to present himself as the victim, even when caught red-handed. But I had learned something crucial during my journey through hell and back. I had learned the power of absolute truth and the unshakable strength that comes from standing in that truth without wavering. I stood at the podium, my hands steady on Emily's pearls, and looked directly at David with a calm, unwavering gaze. I let him finish his performance, let him expose his desperation and malice to this room full of people who understood exactly what predators look like. Are you finished, David? I asked quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone to every corner of the room. The question hung in the air like a challenge. David's face flushed red with fury at my composure, at my refusal to be shaken by his theater. He had expected me to crumble to defend myself frantically, to give him the emotional reaction he could use to further his narrative. Instead, I simply waited, surrounded by the truth that had set me free, ready to let that truth speak for itself once more. The silence in the room was profound as I stood calmly at the podium, my gaze never leaving David's face. This was my moment, not just to defend myself, but to demonstrate the power of truth over manipulation, of dignity over desperation. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice clear and strong, you have just witnessed a perfect example of why our work protecting seniors is so crucial. The man who just disrupted our gathering is indeed David Miller, the same David Miller who was convicted on 7 counts of elder fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. I gestured to George, who stood and nodded to Detective Chen. She rose from her seat, her badge clearly visible, and moved toward the back of the room where David stood. What you've witnessed is a predator's final attempt to rewrite history. I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. David Miller stole my life savings, violated my grief, and desecrated my daughter's memory. But more importantly, he represents a pattern of behavior that threatens every vulnerable person in our community. George approached the podium carrying a laptop, which he connected to the large screen behind me. 3 months ago, I announced, David's co-conspirator, the young man who posed as my grandson, provided a full video confession as part of his plea agreement. I believe it's time for you to hear the truth in his own words. The screen flickered to life, showing Ethan in an institutional setting, his face haggard and remorseful. The audio was crystal clear as he began to speak. My name is Ethan Walsh, and I want to confess to my role in defrauding Mrs. Shirley Donovan. David Miller approached me 6 months ago with a plan to impersonate her grandson. He coached me for weeks, teaching me details about her daughter Emily, showing me how to mimic certain mannerisms, even providing me with forged documents. The room was completely silent except for Ethan's voice continuing his confession. I watched David's face drain of color as his final house of cards began to collapse. David told me Mrs. Donovan was wealthy and lonely, that her grief over her daughter's death made her an easy target. He said it would be simple. I just had to pretend to be Emily's secret son, gain her trust, and help him transfer her assets. He promised me 20% of whatever we could steal. Several people in the audience gasped audibly. The woman who had been supporting David began backing away from him, her face showing dawning horror as she realized what she had been defending. "I want to make it clear," Ethan continued on the recording, "that Mrs. Donovan was completely innocent. She believed she was helping her grandson, honoring her daughter's memory. David manipulated her grief in the cruelest way possible. I'm deeply ashamed of my part in this crime." When the video ended, I turned to face David directly. He stood frozen, his mouth open, any words of defense dying in his throat as the full weight of his exposure settled over him. "David," I said, my voice resonating with the authority of absolute truth, "the court has spoken. Your lies have been exposed by your own accomplice. The truth, unlike your illusions, cannot be denied or rewritten with theater and false witnesses." I stepped down from the podium, moving closer to where he stood, my voice never wavering. "Your greed drove you to desecrate Emily's memory, to weaponize a mother's love, to turn sacred grief into profit. But it has only led to your own destruction." The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. What had begun as confusion and doubt became a wave of outrage and disgust directed entirely at David. The murmurs turned to angry voices, calling him despicable, heartless, a monster who preyed on grieving mothers. The elderly man who had been supporting him stared in shock, then turned and walked rapidly toward the exit, clearly wanting no further association with David. The woman who had spoken up for him covered her mouth in horror tears, streaming down her face as she realized she had been used as another prop in his manipulation. "You destroyed yourself, David." I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "Emily's truth was always stronger than your lies. Her memory was always more powerful than your greed. And justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied." Detective Chen reached David's side, her handcuffs ready. "David Miller," she said clearly, "you're under arrest for violating the terms of your bail and for harassment. You have the right to remain silent." David's face cycled through expressions of rage, desperation, and finally complete defeat. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked around the room at faces filled with contempt and disgust. His final gambit had not only failed, it had destroyed any remaining shred of sympathy anyone might have felt for him. "This isn't over," he shouted as Detective Chen led him toward the exit. "You can't destroy me. I won't let you destroy me." But his words rang hollow in the ears of people who had just witnessed the complete exposure of his true nature. His threats sounded like the impotent rage of someone who had finally run out of victims, out of schemes, out of chances to reinvent his failures as someone else's fault. As he was led from the building, the room erupted in supportive applause, not for his removal, but for the demonstration they had just witnessed of how truth and courage could triumph over even the most sophisticated predator. I returned to the podium to accept my award, but more importantly, to address the deeper meaning of what had just occurred. "What you witnessed tonight," I told the audience, "is why our work matters. Predators count on our shame, our confusion, our willingness to doubt ourselves when they present alternative versions of reality. But truth has a power that lies simply cannot match. And when we stand together in that truth, we become unshakable." The standing ovation that followed was not just for me, but for every survivor in that room who had found the courage to speak their truth, to seek justice, and to transform their pain into protection for others. 5 years had passed since that night at the community center. 5 years of peaceful mornings in my restored home of meaningful work, expanding Emily's foundation of genuine friendships built on trust and shared purpose. I had created a life of such richness and contentment that David Miller had become little more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale I shared in my advocacy work, but no longer a source of personal pain. The garden that Emily had loved as a child was in full bloom that September afternoon when I heard the hesitant knock on my front door. I wasn't expecting visitors, and something about the tentative, almost apologetic sound of the knocking made me pause as I walked through the hallway Emily had run through as a little girl. Through the peephole, I saw a figure that was barely recognizable. David Miller stood on my porch, but he was a shadow of the confident predator who had once invaded my life. Prison had aged him decades. His hair was completely gray now, his frame gaunt, his clothes, clean but clearly secondhand, hanging loosely on his diminished frame. For a moment, I simply stood there studying this broken man through the small circle of glass. 5 years ago, the sight of him would have filled me with rage, fear, or at least emotional turmoil. Now I felt nothing but a cool, detached curiosity about what could have brought him to my door. I opened the door but did not invite him in. He stood there for a long moment, seeming to struggle with how to begin, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to meet my eyes. "Shirley," he said finally, his voice hoarse and uncertain. Thank you for not calling the police immediately." "What do you want, David?" I asked calmly, my voice neither welcoming nor hostile, simply neutral, as if he were a stranger asking for directions. And then the performance began. He dropped to his knees on my front porch, tears streaming down his face in what appeared to be genuine anguish. "Shirley, please, I'm begging you to listen to me. I've lost everything. My freedom, my reputation, my family. What little family I had left. I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to." His voice broke with what seemed like authentic emotion. "I spent 5 years in prison thinking about what I did to you, what I did to Emily's memory. 5 years of lying awake at night, consumed by guilt and shame. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but I've changed, Shirley. I've learned what it means to lose everything, to be truly powerless and alone." I stood in my doorway, unmoved by his tears, watching this display with the clinical detachment of someone observing a particularly transparent magic trick. "I found religion in prison." He continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. "I discovered what it means to truly repent, to seek forgiveness from the people you've wronged. I know I don't deserve your mercy, but I'm praying, I'm literally praying, that somewhere in your heart you might find it possible to forgive me." He gestured to his shabby clothes, his hollow cheeks. "Look at me, Shirley. I'm broken. I'm humbled. I have nothing left but the hope that the woman who raised such a compassionate daughter might have enough kindness in her heart to help a man who has truly learned from his mistakes." It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. The tears seemed real, the desperation authentic, the remorse convincing. If I hadn't spent months being manipulated by this same man, if I hadn't learned to recognize the calculating intelligence behind his emotional displays, I might have been moved. Instead, I simply waited for him to finish. "I'm not asking for much," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just a chance to prove I've changed. Maybe just a warm meal, a place to stay for a night or two while I figure out what to do next. I know it's a lot to ask, but surely I have literally nowhere else to turn." When he finally fell silent, still kneeling on my porch, still weeping what appeared to be tears of genuine repentance, I looked down at him with the same calm expression I had worn throughout his entire performance. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He had clearly expected either immediate rejection or more likely some sign that his emotional manipulation was having its intended effect. "David," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I want you to understand something very important. The man I once tolerated as Emily's husband died the moment he chose to exploit a mother's grief for profit. What kneels before me now is not that man seeking redemption. It's simply the consequence of your own choices, trying to avoid responsibility one final time." I paused, letting the words sink in, watching his face, as the reality of my complete immunity to his manipulation became clear. "You speak of repentance and change, but your presence here proves you've learned nothing. A truly repentant man would leave his victims in peace, would find his own way forward, without expecting those he harmed to provide comfort or assistance. Your being here asking me for help shows that you still believe your needs matter more than the peace of the people you destroyed." His tears stopped flowing as quickly as they had begun, replaced by something harder, more familiar, the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had proven unexpectedly resilient. "My home is a sanctuary now, David." I continued, my voice never wavering. "It's a place where Emily's memory is honored, where truth lives, where I have built a life of genuine peace and purpose. You have no place in that sanctuary. You never did." I stepped back and began to close the door, but paused for one final observation. "I feel no anger toward you anymore, David. No hatred, no desire for revenge. I feel nothing at all when I look at you, and that emptiness where you once caused such pain is perhaps the greatest victory of all. You simply don't matter enough to disturb my peace anymore." I closed the door gently, but firmly turned the deadbolt and returned to my afternoon tea as if nothing had happened. Through the window, I watched him remain on his knees for several minutes, as if unable to process the completeness of his rejection. Finally, he stood, slowly, looked once more at the door that would never open for him again, and walked away down the street where Emily had once ridden her bicycle, disappearing forever from the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of his betrayal. As the sun sets behind the oak tree that Emily used to climb, I sit peacefully on my porch, surrounded by the roses Harold planted for our 10th anniversary. The garden is fuller now, more beautiful than it ever was before, tended with the same care I've brought to rebuilding my life from the devastation David once caused. Emily's Scholarship Foundation has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. What began as a small memorial has become a nationwide network supporting both education and elder fraud prevention. Each student we help, each senior we protect from predators, adds another layer of meaning to Emily's legacy. A legacy that David tried to destroy, but ultimately only made stronger. The house feels alive again, filled with the laughter of friends who visit regularly, the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, and the profound peace that comes from living in complete alignment with truth. I have learned that real family isn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by love, loyalty, and the choice to honor what matters most. My journey through betrayal taught me that grief, while it makes us vulnerable, also has the power to make us unbreakable when we refuse to let it be weaponized against us. The most insidious predators prey on our deepest loves, but an unwavering spirit, armed with truth and supported by genuine community, can reclaim not just what was stolen, but something far more precious: the ability to trust again, to love again, to hope again. I have discovered that justice isn't always swift, but it is inevitable when we have the courage to stand in our truth without wavering. And forgiveness doesn't mean allowing those who harmed us back into our lives. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for them is to let the consequences of their choices teach them what our mercy could not. As twilight deepens and the first stars appear over the home where 3 generations of my family have loved and been loved, I touch the locket around my neck, the one containing Emily's hair, the one that helped prove the truth when truth seemed impossible to reach. Emily's memory is truly honored now, I whisper to the evening air, and I am finally completely free. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sanctuary I have built from the ruins of my former life, I feel not just peace, but profound gratitude. Gratitude for the strength I discovered I possessed, for the friends who stood with me in truth, for the chance to transform my deepest pain into protection for others. The roses Harold planted still bloom each year, more beautiful than ever. Emily's foundation touches new lives daily, and I have learned that even in our darkest valleys, when betrayal seems to have stolen everything we hold dear, the human spirit possesses a resilience that no amount of cruelty can permanently break. Some battles we win not by fighting, but by refusing to be destroyed. Some victories come not through revenge, but through rebuilding something better than what was lost. And sometimes the greatest triumph is simply the quiet peace of a life well lived, surrounded by love that no predator can ever steal or counterfeit. I am Shirley May Donovan. I am 78 years old, and I am home.